A mountain man rescued an obese 16-year-old from Quicksand, but what he did to her next shocked everyone. The wind howls through the Bitterroot foothills. A cry slices the air. Through the reeds, a lone figure hauls a young ranch girl from the sucking mire, her skirts heavy with mud, her breath ragged. But salvation is only the beginning. In a town where whispers cut deeper than knives, every step she takes is shadowed by cruelty, and a stepmother with eyes fixed on selling her late mother's land. Yet this quiet rescuer sees something no one else will: worth. When a hidden deed, a burning barn, and a ruthless railroad agent collide, their fight for a meadow of blue wildflowers becomes a battle for dignity itself. Will the girl the town tried to shame find the courage to stand, or will the frontier swallow her dreams whole? Every time I see your comments, I'm reminded how stories connect us across distances, backgrounds, and hearts. If values like respect, courage, and compassion still guide you, then you're part of this story too. Through the hazy morning light, Jonas Clay studied the trembling girl before him. Her dark hair had come loose from its pins, and her dress was heavy with mud and marsh water. She clutched his wool blanket tight around her shoulders, her breathing still uneven from the ordeal. "Best take another sip," Jonas said, offering his battered tin cup. "Slow now." Clara May's hands shook as she accepted the water. The cup clinked against her teeth and some spilled down her chin. She didn't seem to notice or care. "I didn't think," she started, then swallowed hard. "Didn't think anyone would hear me out here." Jonas settled back on his haunches, giving her space while keeping a watchful eye. The spring air was crisp, carrying the scent of new growth and thawing earth. A red-winged blackbird called from the cattails, its morning song clear and strong. "Reckon I was meant to be checking my snares just then," he said quietly. "The Lord works in mysterious ways." Clara dabbed at her eyes with the edge of the blanket. "Mama used to say that too." Her voice caught on the word mama, and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. Jonas pulled his pipe from his vest pocket but didn't light it. The familiar weight in his hands was comfort enough. "Your mama was Sarah Whitaker." Clara nodded, surprise flickering across her face. "You knew her?" "Knew of her," Jonas said. "Folk spoke well of her healing ways with plants and such. Sorry to hear of her passing last winter." Clara's shoulders hunched inward at the mention of her mother's death. "Thank you," she whispered. Then, after a moment, "She loved this meadow. Used to gather herbs here in the spring." Jonas nodded, understanding dawning. This wasn't just any stretch of marshland. It was a place of memory for the girl. Sacred ground in its way. "That's why you came out here alone?" he asked gently. Clara's fingers worried at a loose thread on the blanket. "Stepmother won't let me tend Mama's garden anymore. Says it's waste of time better spent on proper work." She drew a shaky breath. "I thought, if I could find some of the early shoots Mama showed me, maybe start my own little patch hidden somewhere." Her voice trailed off as a gust of wind rustled through the reeds. Jonas waited, knowing there was more she needed to say. "I should have known better than to venture so far into the marsh," she continued. "Mama always warned about the quicksand here in spring, but I saw what looked like marsh marigolds starting to bloom, and She gestured helplessly. "I just wanted something of hers to hold on to." Jonas studied the ground where Clara had been trapped. The deceptively solid-looking surface betrayed no sign of the danger lurking beneath. Many a good horse and rider had been lost to such places over the years. "No shame in missing your mama," he said. "But you're right, marshland's treacherous this time of year. Next time you want to gather, might be wise to bring someone along." Clara's face fell. There's no one." She picked at the mud drying on her skirts. "People in town, they don't much care for my company." Jonas had heard the cruel whispers about Sarah Whitaker's daughter, how she'd grown too big, too quiet, too different from the other girls her age. Small minds in small towns could be merciless that way. "Well," he said, standing slowly and brushing off his buckskins, "I reckon I know something about keeping to myself, but even a lone wolf needs help now and then." He offered her his hand. Clara stared at it for a long moment before accepting. Her grip was stronger than he expected as he helped her to her feet. "Thank you, Mr. Clay," she said formally, though her eyes held a glimmer of something like hope. "I'm much obliged for the rescue." "Jonas," he corrected. "Mr. Clay was my father. God rest him." He gathered his pack and rope, checking that everything was secure. "Now then, which way's home for you?" "The Whitaker place," she said. "About 2 miles south, near Pine Creek." Jonas nodded. "I'll see you there safe." "Oh no, I couldn't impose," Clara protested, but Jonas held up a hand. "No imposition. These parts ain't safe for lone travel, especially after a scare like that. Besides," he added with a slight smile, "your mama would have my hide if I left you to wander alone." A ghost of a smile touched Clara's lips. She would at that. They set off through the marsh, Jonas leading the way along the firmer ground. He kept their pace steady but unhurried, noting how Clara's steps grew more certain as they went. The morning mist was burning off, revealing a sky of perfect spring blue. A pair of sandhill cranes lifted off from a nearby pond, their distinctive calls echoing across the landscape. Clara paused to watch them, wonder briefly replacing the worry on her face. "Mama loved watching the cranes return," she said softly. "Said it meant winter's back was finally broken." Jonas made a sound of agreement. "Smart woman, your mama. Nature's got its own calendar, more reliable than any almanac." They walked in comfortable silence for a while, broken only by the squelch of boots in mud and the occasional meadowlark song. Jonas found himself impressed by Clara's quiet endurance. Despite her size and the morning's trauma, she kept up without complaint, picking her way carefully through the rough terrain. As they neared the edge of the marsh, Clara spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've never told anyone this, but sometimes I dream Mama's still here, teaching me about the plants and their ways." She paused, then added, "In the dreams, I'm different too. Stronger. More like she wanted me to be." Jonas considered his words carefully before responding. "Seems to me you're plenty strong already. Takes courage to admit when you're scared, to accept help when it's offered." He gestured to the brightening horizon. "Your mama saw something special in this land, in its healing powers. Reckon she saw the same in you." Color rose in Clara's cheeks at his words, but she didn't look away. "Do you really believe that?" "I do," Jonas said simply. "And I believe the Lord put me in your path today for a reason. Sometimes the hardest part of healing is knowing you don't have to do it alone." They crested a small rise, and the Whitaker ranch came into view below. Smoke rose from the chimney, and a few chickens scratched in the yard. Clara's steps slowed. "Stepmother will be angry I went out so early," she said, anxiety creeping back into her voice. Jonas adjusted his pack. "Want me to speak with her? Explain about the quicksand?" Clara shook her head quickly. "No, please. It would only make things worse." She began unwrapping his blanket, but Jonas stopped her. "Keep it," he said. "You can return it another time." Understanding passed between them, an unspoken promise of future meetings, of friendship offered and accepted. "Same time next week?" Jonas suggested casually. "I know some spots where the early medicines grow, safe from quicksand. Might be able to show you, if you're interested." Clara's eyes widened. "You'd do that?" "Reckon I would." Jonas tipped his hat. "Your mama's knowledge shouldn't be lost, and everyone needs a friend now and then, even old mountain men like me." A real smile broke across Clara's face, transforming it entirely. "Thank you, Jonas," she said. "For everything." Jonas watched as she made her way down the path to the ranch house, his blanket still wrapped around her shoulders like a shield. The morning sun caught in her hair, and for a moment, he could almost see Sarah Whitaker's daughter as she truly was. Not the awkward, shunned girl the town saw, but a young woman with her mother's strength running quiet and deep beneath the surface. The wind shifted, carrying the promise of another spring storm. Jonas turned back toward the foothills, his mind already planning which healing plants he'd show Clara next week. Sometimes, he reflected, the Lord's greatest mercies came disguised as simple things. A cry carried on the wind, a rope thrown in time, a chance to pass on knowledge that might otherwise be lost. He smiled, thinking of Sarah Whitaker and her green-touched wisdom. Yes, the Lord did work in mysterious ways, and sometimes those mysteries looked an awful lot like hope taking root in freshly thawed ground. Clara hugged Jonas's blanket tighter around her shoulders as she caught her breath. The morning sun had begun to warm the air, but she couldn't stop shivering. Her sodden dress clung to her frame, and mud squelched in her boots with every step. She began, her voice trembling. I saw the blue wildflowers, just like the ones Mama used to love. Her eyes lifted to the distant marsh where patches of azure dotted the wetlands. Mountain lupine, she called them, said they were God's way of painting hope across the spring earth. Jonas followed her gaze, noting how the delicate blooms swayed in the morning breeze. Your mama had a way with words, he said softly, and an eye for beauty. I thought I could gather some, maybe dry them like she taught me. Clara's voice caught, but I lost the trail, and then the ground. She shuddered, remembering the terrible sensation of being pulled under. Here now, Jonas said, his weathered face creasing with concern. Let's get you home before you catch your death. He offered his arm, strong and steady. Mind if I help you along? Clara hesitated only a moment before accepting. His support at her elbow was gentle but firm, anchoring her as they began their slow journey across the uneven ground. The going was difficult. Her skirts, heavy with marsh water and mud, dragged at her legs. Every few steps she had to pause to catch her breath, embarrassment coloring her cheeks at her slow pace. But Jonas never showed a hint of impatience, matching his stride to hers without comment. When they reached a massive old cottonwood, its branches just beginning to show spring green, Jonas suggested they rest. He helped Clara settle on a sun-warmed root before reaching into his leather pack. Not much, he said, pulling out a small cloth-wrapped bundle, but sharing makes any meal better. He opened it to reveal strips of dried venison jerky, dark and fragrant with smoke. Clara's stomach rumbled, reminding her she'd left home without breakfast. She accepted a piece with murmured thanks, trying not to show how her hands still shook. I'm sorry to be such a burden, she said after a few bites, attempting a weak smile. Seems like clumsiness follows me everywhere these days. Jonas's face grew serious. Nothing clumsy about following your heart towards something beautiful, he said firmly. Your mama knew that. Don't you go blaming yourself for where that path led. The simple dignity in his words brought unexpected tears to Clara's eyes. She looked down quickly, focusing on the jerky in her hands. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun climbed higher, until Jonas noticed Clara's shivering had finally eased. Ready to press on? He asked, gathering their few things. Clara nodded, accepting his help to stand. The rest had done her good, and she moved with more confidence as they continued their journey. The familiar shape of the Whitaker ranch began to emerge through the morning haze. The weathered clapboard house with its sagging porch, the split-rail corral where a few horses dozed in the spring sunshine, thin trails of wood smoke rising from the kitchen chimney. As they approached, the front door opened with a sharp crack. Myra Whitaker emerged onto the porch, her thin frame rigid with displeasure. She wore a pressed calico dress despite the early hour, her dark hair severely pinned, and her lips pressed into a bloodless line as she took in Clara's bedraggled appearance. "Where have you been, girl?" she demanded, ignoring Jonas completely. "Running wild since dawn. No word to anyone, looking like something dragged from a pig wallow." Clara seemed to shrink beside him, her brief confidence evaporating. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I just wanted to embarrass us further, I suppose," Myra cut in, "as if this family hasn't endured enough scandal without you wandering like a fool." Jonas stepped forward, touching his hat brim respectfully. "Begging your pardon, Mrs. Whitaker. There was an accident at the marsh." "I don't recall asking for your input, Mr. Clay." Myra's voice could have frosted summer leaves. She didn't even glance at his outstretched hand. "Clara May, get yourself inside and cleaned up before anyone else sees you in this state. You have chores waiting." Clara cast one last look at Jonas, gratitude and apology mingling in her expression, before hurrying past her stepmother into the house. Myra followed, closing the door with firm finality. Jonas stood for a moment, noting how the house seemed dim despite the brightening day. Then he turned and started back toward his familiar foothills, aware of eyes watching from behind lace curtains, until he disappeared into the distance. The morning's events had shaken loose memories he'd rather keep buried, of other young souls weighted down by others' judgment, of beauty and kindness dismissed as weakness. He thought of Clara's face when she spoke of her mother's flowers, how light had briefly transformed her features despite her fear and exhaustion. A meadowlark's song pierced the morning quiet, clear and sweet. Jonas adjusted his pack, his boots finding their rhythm on the familiar trail. Behind him, the Whitaker ranch grew smaller, but he could still feel Clara's eyes following his departure, full of unspoken words and lonely questions that echoed his own. The sun climbed higher, burning off the last of the morning mist. Spring was taking hold in the Bitterroot foothills, bringing change with every passing day. Jonas had lived long enough to know that change, like the seasons themselves, couldn't be held back by any human hand, not even one as rigid as Myra Whitaker's. He thought again of the mountain lupine, how it found purchase in the harshest soil, turning barren ground into gardens of impossible blue. Nature had its own wisdom, its own way of persisting despite all odds. The same strength that drove those flowers toward the light lived in Clara May Whitaker, whether her stepmother chose to see it or not. Jonas reached the ridge that marked his usual hunting grounds, pausing to catch his breath. The morning's rescue had taken more out of him than he cared to admit, but he couldn't find it in himself to regret a single moment. Sometimes the Lord's work came in unexpected ways, asking nothing more than that you be present when needed, steady when called upon. The wind shifted, carrying the sweet scent of spring grass and distant lupine. Jonas squared his shoulders and continued on his way, leaving the Whitaker ranch and its troubles behind. But something had changed in the morning's passing, a connection forged, a promise made in shared silence, a reminder that even in the loneliest corners of the territory, God's grace could bloom as suddenly as wildflowers after rain. The setting sun painted long shadows across the Bitterroot foothills as Jonas Clay guided his horse down the winding trail toward Pine Ridge. His saddlebags bulged with carefully wrapped pelts, beaver, marten, and a prime winter fox that ought to fetch a fair price at Dobbin's General Store. The spring air held a lingering chill, carrying the scent of wood smoke from the town's chimneys. His mind kept drifting back to that morning's rescue, to Clara May's trembling gratitude and her stepmother's icy dismissal. The memory of Myra Whitaker's cold eyes made him adjust his collar against a phantom chill. Something about that woman set his instincts on edge like the unsettling quiet before a storm. Pine Ridge emerged from the gathering dusk, a collection of wooden buildings strung along a single dusty main street. Lamplight spilled from the windows of the general store, creating pools of yellow warmth on the weathered boardwalk. Jonas dismounted near the hitching post, his boots striking the packed earth with a solid thud. A cluster of ranch hands lounged against the store's facade, passing a whiskey bottle between them. The sweet, sour smell of cheap liquor mingled with tobacco smoke. Jonas recognized a few faces from the double-bar spread, young bucks with more swagger than sense. He nodded briefly, intending to pass them without engaging. "Hey there, mountain man," one called out, voice thick with drink. "Heard you went fishing for land whales this morning." Coarse laughter rippled through the group. Jonas kept his face carefully neutral as he collected his pelts. "Marsh-stuck heifer, that's what I heard," another drawled, triggering fresh guffaws. "Surprised she didn't sink clean to China." "Waste of a good rope if you ask me," a third added, taking a long pull from the bottle. "Could have used it for something worthwhile, instead of hauling out that—" Jonas's hands tightened on his leather sack until his knuckles whitened. The muscles in his jaw worked as he fought down the urge to teach these pups some manners. But violence wouldn't help Clara's situation, might even make things worse for her. Instead, he straightened to his full height, letting his shadow fall across their gathering. The laughter died away under his steady gaze. These boys might be liquored up, but they weren't so drunk they couldn't read the warning in his posture. Without a word, Jonas stepped past them and pushed through the store's door, setting the bell jingling. Inside, coal oil lamps cast a warm glow over shelves stocked with dry goods, tools, and sundries. The familiar smells of coffee, leather, and sugar wrapped around him like a comfortable blanket. Behind the scarred counter, Herbert Dobbins looked up from his ledger, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles. "Evening, Jonas," the storekeeper said, marking his place with a pencil. "Brought some trades, have you?" Jonas set his sack on the counter, carefully unwrapping each pelt. "Fair catch this season," he said simply, smoothing the fox fur with practiced hands. Dobbins examined each piece with professional interest, holding them up to the lamplight. "Fine work as always," he commented, reaching for his cash box. "Say, heard tell the Whitaker girl made it back all right?" His tone was carefully casual, but Jonas caught the gleam of curiosity in his eyes. "She did." Jonas kept his voice neutral, not encouraging further discussion. "Lucky thing you were passing by," Dobbins continued, counting out bills. "Marsh can be treacherous this time of year. Wouldn't want to lose another Whitaker so soon after poor Thomas." Jonas pocketed the money without counting it. Dobbins was honest in his dealings, if overly fond of gossip. "Reckon that's their business," he said firmly. The storekeeper took the hint, wrapping Jonas's usual supplies, coffee, flour, salt pork, in brown paper. Outside, the ranch hands' voices had grown louder again, their laughter carrying through the walls. Jonas gathered his purchases quickly, eager to be away from town and its wagging tongues. But as he stepped onto the boardwalk, the deep tone of the church bell caught his attention. 8 strong peals marked the evening hour, echoing across the darkening street. Movement near the church drew his eye. 2 figures stood in the shadow of the white-painted steeple, their heads close together in conversation. Even in the dim light, Jonas recognized Myra Whitaker's rigid posture. The man she spoke with was a stranger to Pine Ridge, tall and citified in a fine wool coat that had never seen ranch work. Something about their furtive manner raised the hair on Jonas's neck. As he watched, Myra withdrew a folded paper from her reticule and passed it to the stranger. The man tucked it into his coat pocket with practiced smoothness, then touched his hat brim in a gesture too elegant for frontier courtesy. They parted ways quickly, Myra hurrying toward her waiting buggy while the stranger disappeared around the church's corner. Jonas found himself gripping his package too tightly, wrinkling the brown paper. That unnamed unease that had dogged him since morning crystallized into something sharper. He couldn't say exactly what he'd witnessed, but his years as an Army scout had taught him to trust his instincts. Something wasn't right about that exchange, something that cast a shadow longer than the failing daylight. The ranch hands had finally wandered off toward the saloon, their cruel laughter fading into the evening air. Jonas mounted his horse with careful movements, settling his supplies in the saddlebags. Above him, stars were beginning to pierce the darkening sky, bright and distant as truth. He turned his horse's head toward home, but his thoughts remained in Pine Ridge, with a young girl who deserved better than mockery, with a stepmother's secret dealings, with a stranger's too smooth manners. The spring wind carried the church bell's last echoes across the valley, a sound both beautiful and somehow mournful in the gathering night. The hoofbeats of Jonas's horse kept steady rhythm as he rode into the darkness, each step taking him closer to his solitary cabin, but leaving questions scattered behind like pebbles on a trail. What business could Myra Whitaker have with a fancy stranger? What was written on that folded paper? And why did his heart tell him it somehow involved Clara May? The Bitterroot Nights held their secrets close, but Jonas had learned long ago that truth, like spring water, had a way of finding its own path to the light. He would keep his eyes open, his mind alert, and most importantly, his heart tuned to the still small voice that had never led him wrong. Dawn crept through the lone window of Jonas Clay's cabin, painting stripes of pale gold across the plank floor. He stirred beneath his wool blankets, listening to the familiar sounds of morning in the foothills, wind in the pines, early birds testing their songs, the crackle of dying embers in his stone fireplace. The events of yesterday tumbled through his mind as he swung his legs over the bed's edge. Clara May's rescue, the cruel taunts in town, and that secretive meeting between Myra Whitaker and the well-dressed stranger stayed with him like burrs caught in a horse's mane. Jonas pulled on his heavy coat and reached for his boots by the door. A dusting of spring snow had fallen overnight, coating them with frost. He brushed them off and laced them tight, his weathered fingers moving with practiced efficiency. The cabin was simple: one room with a fireplace, bed, table, and the basic tools of frontier life hanging from pegs on the log walls. But it was home, and its simplicity suited him. He stirred the banked coals and added kindling, watching the flames catch and grow. A pot of coffee later, Jonas stepped out onto his porch, surveying the mountain vista spread before him. His mule, Dan, nickered a morning greeting from the lean-to shelter. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and melting snow. "What do you say we pay a visit down valley?" Jonas asked the mule as he approached with a measure of grain. Dan's ears perked forward at his voice. "Got some venison that needs eating before it spoils." The haunch of deer meat was carefully wrapped in burlap, secured behind his saddle. It was the excuse, of course. He had plenty of ways to preserve meat. But something drew him back to the Whitaker place, a need to ensure Clara May was all right after yesterday's ordeal. The ride down took the better part of an hour, Dan picking his way carefully along the spring-softened trail. Jonas used the time to gather his thoughts, trying to make sense of what he'd witnessed in town. That fancy stranger had the look of someone used to making deals, not working land. And what business would bring him to meet Myra Whitaker in secret? The Whitaker ranch came into view. House, barn, and corrals nestled in a protected valley bottom. Smoke rose straight and steady from the kitchen chimney. Jonas guided Dan through the front gate, noting the empty hitching post. No sign of Myra's buggy. He dismounted near the side door, the one that led to the kitchen. Before he could knock, the door creaked open slightly, and Clara May's face appeared in the gap. Her eyes widened in recognition. "Mr. Clay," she said softly, a shy smile touching her lips. "I didn't expect—" "Brought some venison," Jonas interrupted gently, keeping his voice casual. "Had more than I can keep fresh. Thought your folk might make use of it." The door opened wider, but before Clara could respond, Myra Whitaker materialized behind her stepdaughter. Her thin frame seemed to fill the doorway, arms crossed over her dark dress. "Mr. Clay." Myra's voice held all the warmth of a February wind. "This is unexpected." Jonas lifted the wrapped meat slightly. "Just passing with some extra venison, Mrs. Whitaker," seemed neighborly to share. Myra's eyes narrowed slightly, but social convention won out. She reached for the package with stiff fingers. "How thoughtful," she said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "Clara, take this to the kitchen." Clara accepted the bundle, her fingers brushing Jonas's briefly. Her eyes held gratitude that had nothing to do with venison. Before Myra could retreat inside, Jonas pressed on. "Been gathering some herbs up in the hills," he said. "Good for winter remedies. Wouldn't mind showing Clara how to dry them proper, if you've a mind." "Clara has plenty to occupy her here," Myra cut in sharply. "And after yesterday's foolishness, she won't be wandering beyond the fence line." She stepped back, clearly dismissing him. "Good day, Mr. Clay." The door closed with quiet finality. Jonas stood for a moment, hearing muffled voices inside. One sharp and commanding, the other soft and acquiescent. He turned toward Dan, adjusting the mule's bridle with careful movements. "Mr. Clay!" Clara's whispered call made him turn. She had slipped around the corner of the house, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "You shouldn't risk getting in trouble," Jonas said quietly, but he didn't move away. Clara twisted her apron in her hands. "I wanted to thank you proper for yesterday. I never said—" She swallowed hard. "She won't let me go past the fence now. Says it's for my own good, but—" "Don't you fret about that," Jonas said, his voice gentle but firm. "I'll check in from time to time. Just being neighborly is all." Tears welled in Clara's eyes, but she blinked them back. "I'd best get back inside," she whispered. "The venison—" "You go on now," Jonas nodded. "Take care, Clara May." He watched her hurry back around the house, noting how she tried to move quietly despite her size. Something protective stirred in his chest, the same feeling that had made him search for the source of that cry in the marsh. The ride home took longer than necessary. Jonas let Dan set an easy pace while his mind worked over the morning's events. Myra's sharp dismissal, Clara's frightened whispers, the restriction to the fence line. None of it sat right with him. Evening found him back in Pine Ridge, supposedly to mail a letter but really to keep his ear to the ground. The saloon would be busy with ranch hands coming in from their day's work. Sometimes a man could learn more from what wasn't said than what was. He tied Dan outside the post office, which doubled as the telegraph office. Inside, the operator was just closing up, but two men lingered, deep in conversation. Jonas recognized one as Herbert Dobbins, the storekeeper. The other was a rancher from up near the pass. "Railroad's dead set on that route," the rancher was saying. "Surveyor was through last week, marking it out." "Right through the Whitaker's lower pasture, ain't it?" Dobbins asked, sorting papers on his desk. Jonas's hand stilled on his letter. The lower pasture. He remembered Clara's voice yesterday, talking about her mother as they walked home. "That's where Mama loved to go," she'd said. "The meadow, where the blue flowers grow in spring." "Shame about the timing," the rancher continued. "Thomas Whitaker would have fought it tooth and nail, but his widow—" He shrugged. "Way I hear it, she's more practical-minded." The pieces clicked into place with cold certainty. The well-dressed stranger, the secret meeting, the folded paper. The railroad wanted the Whitaker land for their spur line, and Myra was willing to sell, regardless of what it meant to Clara or her mother's memory. Jonas stepped back outside, letting the conversation fade behind him. The spring evening was settling over Pine Ridge, stars pricking through the darkening sky. He untied Dan's reins with slow, deliberate movements, his mind already shifting from understanding to resolve. He'd seen too much wrong done in his life, to the land, to the people who loved it. The memory of broken promises during his scouting days still burned. But this time, maybe, he could do something about it. Clara May deserved better than to lose her mother's meadow to railroad ties and graded earth. Dan's hooves struck a steady rhythm on the packed dirt as they headed home. Jonas sat straight in the saddle, his path suddenly clearer than it had been in years. Being neighborly, he'd told Clara. Well, sometimes being neighborly meant standing up for what was right even when it wasn't easy. The mountain air grew cooler as they climbed, carrying the sound of coyotes calling in the distance. Jonas counted the stars emerging overhead, each one a bright point in the gathering darkness, each one a reason to keep faith. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for tonight, he had purpose again. And that was worth more than all the railroad gold in the territory. 2 days after his last visit, Jonas Clay guided Dan down the familiar trail to the Whitaker Ranch. The morning sun cast long shadows across the valley, and a crisp spring breeze carried the scent of thawing earth. In his saddlebag, a fresh haunch of venison nestled beside an empty egg basket, a practical excuse for another visit. The ranch was stirring with morning activity. Chickens scratched in the yard and smoke curled from the kitchen chimney. Jonas dismounted near the barn, noting with relief that Myra's buggy was gone again. As he secured Dan's reins to the hitching post, movement caught his eye. Clara May emerged from the barn carrying a wooden bucket of feed. Her cheeks were pink from the morning chill, and wisps of hair had escaped her bonnet. When she spotted Jonas, a smile brightened her face. "Mr. Clay," she said softly, setting down the bucket. "Are you—" She glanced toward the house. "Are you trading again today?" Jonas patted his saddlebag. "Thought I might swap some venison for eggs if you've got any to spare." He kept his voice casual, matter of fact. "Your stepmother about?" "Gone to town for supplies." Clara's shoulders relaxed slightly. "She won't be back till afternoon." Jonas nodded, considering. "Might be a good time to show you some things about the land hereabouts." He gestured to the fence line that marked the property boundary. "Nothing beyond the fence, mind. Just what any rancher ought to know about their own place." Clara's eyes widened with interest. "I'd like that very much, Mr. Clay." "Best fetch those eggs first," he suggested. "Keep everything proper and businesslike." While Clara gathered eggs from the henhouse, Jonas transferred the venison to the kitchen's cool storage. When she returned with a basket full of brown eggs, he packed them carefully in his saddlebag, wrapped in clean straw. "Now then," he said, offering his arm in a courtly gesture that made her smile. "Shall we walk the fence line?" They started along the eastern boundary, where split rails separated pasture from scrubland. Jonas moved at an easy pace, matching Clara's shorter steps. He pointed out details she might have missed, subtle signs that spoke volumes to those who knew how to read them. "See there?" He indicated a worn path through the grass. "That's a game trail. Deer mostly, maybe elk in season. They come down from the hills for water, follow the same route most every day." Clara studied the packed earth with new eyes. "I never noticed before, but now I can see where they've walked." "Good eye," Jonas approved. "And over here." He led her to a patch of low-growing shrubs with dark berries. "These are service berries. Good eating when they're ripe, and the birds love them. Your mother might have shown you these?" "She did." Clara's face lit up with memory. "We used to pick them together. She'd make the most wonderful preserves." Her voice trailed off, but Jonas saw the spark of joy the memory brought her. They continued along the fence, Jonas pointing out medicinal plants, yarrow for bleeding, willow bark for pain, mint for upset stomachs. Clara listened intently, asking thoughtful questions that showed her quick mind. When they reached a stand of wild roses, she surprised him by identifying them first. "Mama said the hips are full of goodness," she explained. "She'd dry them for tea in winter." Jonas nodded approvingly. "Your mother taught you well. Seems to me she knew the real value of this land." They paused at the corner post where the fence turned north. Clara's gaze drifted to the distant meadow, just visible through a gap in the trees. "That's where the blue flowers grow," she said softly. "Mama loved them so. We'd go every spring." "I remember those flowers," Jonas said quietly. "Been watching them bloom for 20 years now. Like clockwork, they come back. Nature's got its own memory, you might say." Clara turned to him, her eyes suddenly bright with tears. "Myra says it's just wasted space. Says the lower pasture could be put to better use, but she won't say how." She twisted her hands in her apron. "I tried to tell her about the flowers, about Mama, but she won't listen." Jonas kept his face carefully neutral, though his jaw tightened slightly. "Some folks measure value different ways," he said diplomatically. "But memory's got its own worth, seems to me." They walked on, following the fence west now. Jonas showed her where rabbits had dug under the rails, where a family of quail nested in the brambles. Clara soaked up every detail, her natural curiosity shining through her usual shyness. "I'll take you to the meadow proper when it's safe," Jonas promised as they rounded the final corner. "Those flowers deserve to be seen up close come spring." Clara's smile was like sunrise. "I'd like that very much, Mr. Clay." The afternoon light was growing golden when they finally turned back toward the house. They'd covered the entire fence line, Clara now armed with new knowledge about the land she'd lived on all her life. But as they approached the yard, voices carried from the front porch. Clara stiffened. A man in a fine coat stood with Myra, both of them bent over papers spread on the porch rail. His well-polished boots and city-cut clothes marked him as an outsider. Clara caught Jonas's sleeve. "That's Mr. Keene," she whispered, her earlier animation fading to anxiety. "He's from the railroad. He's been coming by more and more lately." Jonas watched the pair on the porch, keeping his expression neutral even as understanding crystallized in his mind. The secret meetings, the talk of better use for the land, the surveyor's marks he'd spotted along their walk, it all pointed to one conclusion. The railroad wanted the lower pasture for their spur line, and Myra was entertaining their offer. "Best get you inside," he said quietly. "Don't want to cause any trouble." Clara nodded, her shoulders slumping. "Thank you for today, Mr. Clay. For showing me. For remembering." "You remember too," he said firmly. "Your mother's knowledge, her love for this land, that's yours by right. Don't let anyone tell you different." They parted at the kitchen door, Clara slipping inside while Jonas retrieved Dan from the hitching post. As he mounted up, he caught Keen watching him from the porch, the railroad man's expression calculating. Jonas touched his hat brim in a minimal gesture of courtesy and turned Dan toward home. The ride back gave him time to think. The railroad agent's presence confirmed his suspicions, but it also meant time was shorter than he'd thought. If Myra was already reviewing papers, the deal might be closer than anyone in town realized. Dan's hooves marked a steady rhythm on the trail, as Jonas considered his options. He'd seen too many people lose what they valued to progress his steady march. But Clara's connection to the land, her mother's memory tied up in that meadow of blue flowers, that was worth fighting for. The sun was setting as they climbed into the foothills, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. Jonas sat straight in the saddle, his resolve hardening with each step toward home. He'd made Clara a promise about the meadow, and he aimed to keep it. The question was how, and how soon he'd have to act. The afternoon sun hung high overhead as Jonas guided Dan down the winding trail toward Pine Ridge. He'd meant to check his trap lines, but something drew him toward town instead, an uneasy feeling he couldn't shake after yesterday's encounter with the railroad man. As Dan picked his way around a bend, Jonas spotted a familiar figure trudging along the dusty road ahead, a covered basket swaying from her arm. Clara wore her faded blue work dress, her dark hair twisted into a simple braid. She walked with her head down, careful steps kicking up little puffs of dust. Jonas clicked his tongue, urging Dan forward until they drew alongside her. "Afternoon, Miss Clara," he called softly, not wanting to startle her. She looked up, shading her eyes against the sun. "Oh, Mr. Clay, good afternoon." "Headed to town?" He patted Dan's neck. "Could give you a ride, save your feet somewhere." Clara adjusted her grip on the basket. "That's kind of you, but I'm not going far. Just taking some eggs to the church pantry." She offered a small smile. "Reverend Tolliver says fresh eggs are always welcome." Jonas nodded, understanding her need to make the journey on her own terms. "Mind if we keep you company a spell?" Dan here could use the easy walking. "I wouldn't mind that at all," she replied, her shoulders relaxing slightly. They continued toward town, Dan ambling along at Clara's pace while Jonas kept a watchful eye on the road ahead. The spring breeze carried the scent of sun-warmed grass and distant rain. "Your stepmother know you're making this trip?" Jonas asked carefully. "She's visiting her sister in Helena for 2 days." Clara's voice held a note of relief. "Left this morning on the early stage. Won't be back till Thursday." Jonas considered this. 2 days without Myra's watchful eye might give him time to learn more about the railroad's plans. But for now, he focused on Clara, noting how she straightened her spine when they approached the first buildings of Pine Ridge. "I'll see to some business while you're at the church," he said as they reached the main street. "Meet you after if you'd like an escort home?" Clara nodded gratefully. "Thank you, Mr. Clay. I shouldn't be more than an hour." Jonas watched her turn toward the church before dismounting and tethering Dan to the hitching post outside the mercantile. He had barely stepped onto the boardwalk when he heard voices from around the corner. Women's voices pitched low but clear enough. "There goes the Whitaker girl again, heavy as ever." The words dripped with false concern. "Lord knows what's to become of her. No man'll want to take that burden on." "Shame about her mama dying so young," another voice added. "Left her with no guidance, poor thing. Just gets bigger every year like rising dough." Jonas recognized the speakers without looking. Mrs. Whitcomb and Mrs. Peterson, wives of local ranchers, women who prided themselves on their Christian charity while dealing in cruel gossip. He started to step forward, then checked himself as he glimpsed Clara frozen on the boardwalk ahead, clearly within earshot. Her face had gone pale, but she didn't turn or acknowledge the whispered words. Instead, she gripped her basket tighter and continued walking, chin lifted slightly. Jonas felt a surge of admiration for her quiet dignity. He strode forward, boots striking the wooden planks with purpose. "Miss Clara," he called warmly, as if he'd just spotted her. "Let me help you with that basket. Looks mighty heavy with all those eggs." The gossiping women fell silent as Jonas reached Clara's side, taking the basket with exaggerated care. "Morning, ladies," he said pointedly, touching the brim of his hat without really looking at them. Their mumbled replies held a note of embarrassment. Clara's cheeks had flushed pink, but grateful understanding showed in her eyes as they walked away together. Jonas kept his stride measured, letting her set the pace as they headed toward the church. The whitewashed building sat on a small rise, its simple steeple reaching toward the cloud-scattered sky. Reverend Tolliver was tending the small garden plot beside the church when they approached. He straightened, brushing dirt from his hands, his kind face creasing in a welcome smile. "Clara May and Mr. Clay, what a pleasant surprise." The Reverend's voice held genuine warmth. "Come to add to our pantry stores?" Clara nodded, taking the basket back from Jonas. "Just some eggs, Reverend. The hens have been laying well." "The Lord provides through faithful hands," Reverend Tolliver said, opening the side door that led to the church kitchen. "These will be a blessing to Widow Morgan. She's been poorly this week." Jonas watched as Clara carefully unpacked the basket, setting out 24 eggs in neat rows. He noted that the eggs were large and clean, the best from the henhouse. She could have sold them in town for good money, but instead they'd go to those in need. "You're a constant help to us, Clara," the Reverend said softly. "Your mother would be proud of your generous heart." Clara ducked her head at the praise, but Jonas saw how the words straightened her shoulders. She was different here, away from her stepmother's critical eye and the town's whispered judgments. Here, her worth was measured by what she gave, not what she looked like. When they finished at the church, Jonas walked Clara back to where Dan waited patiently in the shade. The afternoon had grown warmer, and Clara's cheeks were flushed from the heat. "Let me give you a ride home," he offered again. "No sense in wearing yourself out completely." This time she accepted, allowing him to help her mount. Jonas swung up behind her, keeping a respectful distance as Dan carried them out of town. The old mule seemed to know they needed a smooth journey, picking his way carefully along the rutted road. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the sound of birds and Dan's steady hoofbeats filling the air. Finally, Jonas spoke. "You're stronger than folks reckon, Miss Clara." He kept his voice matter-of-fact, not wanting to embarrass her. "Takes courage to keep being kind in the face of meanness." Clara's hands tightened on the saddle horn. "Sometimes I don't feel strong at all," she admitted quietly. "Sometimes I wish I could just disappear." "Your mama didn't raise you to disappear," Jonas said firmly. "She raised you to bloom right where you're planted, like those flowers you both loved." He felt her take a shaky breath. "I miss her so much, Mr. Clay. Everything's different now. Myra wants to change everything, sell pieces of the ranch. I don't know how to stop it." Jonas thought of the railroad man, of the papers he'd seen on the porch. The threat to Clara's mother's meadow felt more urgent with each passing day. But for now, he focused on the immediate need, building up the spirit of the young woman before him. "You're not alone in this," he said simply. "Remember that." They reached the Whitaker Ranch as the afternoon light began to soften toward evening. Jonas helped Clara down from Dan's back, steadying her until her feet were firmly planted. "Thank you," she said, looking up at him, "for everything today." Jonas tipped his hat. "Just being neighborly, Miss Clara. You take care now." He turned Dan toward home, his mind already working on the problem of the meadow. The railroad might have money and influence on their side, but Jonas had seen too many good things destroyed in the name of progress. He wouldn't let it happen again. Not to Clara's inheritance, not to her mother's memory. The sun was setting behind the mountains as they climbed the trail home, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Dan's hooves kicked up dust that caught the fading light like golden mist. Jonas sat straight in the saddle, turning over possibilities in his mind. There had to be a way to protect the meadow, to honor both Clara's mother's memory and Clara's own quiet strength. He just had to figure out how. Morning sunlight filtered through the pine branches as Jonas Clay guided his mule Dan down the winding trail toward Pine Ridge. The steady clip-clop of hooves on packed earth matched the rhythm of his thoughts. He'd been up since before dawn, unable to shake the nagging feeling about the railroad's interest in the Whitaker meadow. The Territorial Land Office might have answers. Jonas had seen enough land disputes in his scouting days to know that original homestead rights could trump later claims, if you had the papers to prove it. The trick was finding out if such protection existed for Clara's mother's land. Pine Ridge's telegraph office occupied a narrow wooden building, wedged between the general store and the blacksmith's shop. The operator, Henry Walsh, sat at his desk, fingers dancing across the brass key as Jonas stepped through the door. The familiar click-clack of Morse code filled the small space. Henry held up one finger, asking Jonas to wait while he finished transmitting his message. Jonas removed his hat and stood patiently, studying the maps tacked to the wall. Territory surveys, railroad routes, cattle trails snaking across Montana's vastness. "What brings you to town, Jonas?" Henry asked finally, turning from his instrument. "Don't often see you unless there's tracking work needed." "Need to send a wire to the Territorial Land Office," Jonas replied, reaching for his coin purse. "Wanting to check on some homestead records." Henry raised his eyebrows but asked no questions as he prepared a fresh message form. Jonas carefully dictated his inquiry about the Whitaker property, specifically mentioning the Lower Meadow parcel and original homestead protections. The message was brief but clear. "Might take a while for a response," Henry warned, already beginning to tap out the message. "Land office gets backed up sometimes." Jonas settled into a wooden chair by the window. "I'll wait." The morning stretched on. Jonas watched town life unfold through the window, ranch hands leading horses to the smithy, women carrying market baskets, children racing past on their way to the schoolhouse. His thoughts kept returning to Clara, wondering how she was faring under her stepmother's sharp eye. Finally, after nearly 2 hours, the telegraph key clattered to life. Henry's pencil flew across the paper, translating the dots and dashes into words. He handed the reply to Jonas with a low whistle. "Interesting response you got there." Jonas read carefully. The land office confirmed that original homestead protections might indeed apply to the meadow, if the original deed could be produced showing continuous family occupancy and use. Without such proof, the land could be considered open for sale or development. Hope and worry warred in Jonas's chest as he folded the paper and tucked it into his shirt pocket. He needed to tell Clara right away, but he'd have to be careful about it. "Much obliged, Henry," he said, placing extra coins on the desk for the operator's patience. "Best keep this between us for now." Henry nodded, already turning back to his regular work. "Wasn't my business to begin with," he said easily. The ride to the Whitaker ranch took longer than usual, with Jonas choosing less traveled paths to avoid being seen. He approached from the back pasture, where the barn's weathered bulk would shield him from the house's windows. Fortune favored him. Through the barn's wide doors, he caught a glimpse of Clara in the loft, sunlight from the high window touching her brown hair with gold as she bent over her work. She was mending something, a leather strap, he realized as he drew closer. "Miss Clara," he called softly, not wanting to startle her. She looked up, surprise and pleasure crossing her face. "Mr. Clay, I didn't expect—" She glanced toward the house, then back to him. "Is everything all right?" "Got some news that might interest you," he said, keeping his voice low. "Mind if I come up?" Clara nodded, setting aside the halter she'd been repairing. Jonas climbed the loft ladder with practiced ease, settling onto a hay bale across from her. The barn's familiar scents surrounded them: sweet hay, leather, warm wood, and the earthy breath of horses below. "I sent a wire to the Territorial Land Office this morning," he began, pulling out the telegram. "Asked about your mother's meadow." Clara's eyes widened as she read the message. "Original homestead protection," she whispered. "Papa always said Mama brought that land to their marriage, but Myra says there's no proof of that anymore." "Your father keep any papers, deeds, records, that sort of thing?" Clara's brow furrowed in thought. "He never kept important papers in the house. Said it wasn't safe, with all the cooking fires and lamps." She looked around the loft, understanding dawning in her eyes. "But he spent a lot of time out here in the barn. Said he liked to think while he worked." Jonas nodded encouragingly. "Reckon this might be a good place to hide something valuable?" "Yes." Clara's voice rose in excitement before she caught herself, continuing more quietly. "There's an old chest up here somewhere, Mama's chest. Papa moved it out after she died. Myra wanted to sell it, but he wouldn't let her." They both looked around the spacious loft. Shadows gathered in the corners where years of accumulated tools, tack, and memories lay waiting to be explored. But they couldn't search now, not with Myra liable to appear at any moment. "We need time," Jonas said, "and privacy." Clara twisted her hands in her apron, thinking. Myra usually goes to town for the Ladies' Aid Society meetings, but lately she's been too busy with the railroad business. As if summoned by their discussion, Myra's voice carried from the house. "Clara May, where are you, girl? These floors won't sweep themselves." "Coming!" Clara called back. She turned to Jonas, speaking quickly. "I'll try to find out when she's going to town next, but how will I let you know?" Jonas considered. "I'll ride past each morning checking snares. If you hang a red cloth on the fence post by the creek, I'll know to come back that evening." Clara nodded, already moving toward the ladder. "I have to go, but Mr. Clay—" She paused, looking back at him. "Thank you for caring about Mama's meadow." Jonas watched her hurry across the yard to the house, her quick steps betraying none of the grace he'd seen in her quiet strength. He waited several minutes before climbing down and leading Dan out the back of the barn, best not to be seen leaving. That evening, as Jonas sat on his cabin's porch watching the sunset paint the mountains, he heard the distant toll of Pine Ridge's church bell. 8 o'clock, time for the Ladies' Aid Society to end their meeting. He wondered if Myra Whitaker regretted missing their gatherings, or if she was too focused on her railroad dealings to care about maintaining social appearances. The answer came sooner than expected. The next evening, as Jonas worked in his vegetable patch, he heard Clara's voice carrying across the cooling air. She was singing, something she rarely did within earshot of others. The sound drew him to the edge of his property where he could just make out movement around the Whitaker house. Myra's voice cut through the peaceful scene. "I'll be at the ladies' supper tomorrow night. Make sure you finish your chores early. I won't have you embarrassing me by leaving things half done." Jonas watched as Clara bobbed her head obediently, but when she turned away from her stepmother, he caught the flash of determination in her face as she glanced toward the barn. Their chance was coming. Tomorrow night they would search for the deed that might save Clara's mother's meadow. Jonas looked toward the distant patch of land, now golden in the setting sun. Something about the way the light caught the swaying grass reminded him of Clara's quiet strength, of her mother's legacy waiting to be protected. He had a feeling they would need both strength and legacy before this was over. Their plan was set. Now they just had to wait for tomorrow night and hope that somewhere in that barn, Clara's mother had left them the key to saving her beloved meadow. The sun had barely begun its descent when Jonas guided his mule along the creek bed, keeping to the shadows. He'd waited until he saw Myra's buggy heading toward town before making his approach. The evening air carried the sweet scent of fresh-cut hay and the distant lowing of cattle being brought in for the night. The barn's weathered doors stood half open, just as Clara had promised. Jonas tied Dan to a post in the shadows and slipped inside. The familiar smells of leather, hay, and horse greeted him, along with the soft shuffling of hooves in their stalls. A flicker of lamplight from above caught his eye. "Mr. Clay?" Clara's whisper floated down from the loft. "It's me," he answered softly, already moving toward the ladder. Clara sat cross-legged on the wooden floor, a tin lantern casting a warm circle of light around her. She'd spread an old horse blanket nearby, creating a makeshift workspace. Her face showed both nervousness and determination. "Myra won't be back until after 9, she said, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "The ladies always talk long after supper's done." Jonas nodded, settling onto his haunches beside her. "Then we'd best make good use of the time. Where should we start?" Clara's eyes swept the shadowy loft. "Papa spent most of his time up here, especially after Mama died. He'd sit for hours, just thinking and working with his hands." She touched a worn leather saddle nearby. "He knew every inch of this place." "Smart man," Jonas said, studying the space with experienced eyes. "Barn loft's got plenty of hiding spots. We'll work systematic-like, start from one end and move to the other." They began their search methodically. Jonas checked beneath loose floorboards while Clara examined the tool racks mounted along the walls. The lantern light threw their shadows large against the rafters as they worked in companionable silence, broken only by the occasional creak of wood or rustle of hay. After nearly an hour, their hands were dusty and their hopes beginning to flag. They'd found nothing but old horseshoes, forgotten tools, and a nest of field mice that sent Clara jumping back with a stifled squeal. "Wait," Clara said suddenly, freezing in place. "I remember something." She closed her eyes, concentrating. "When I was little, maybe 7 or 8, I came up here once while Papa was working. He was putting something away in one of the rafter boxes, those wooden compartments where we store extra hay for winter." Jonas followed her gaze to the ceiling where several wooden boxes were mounted between the heavy support beams. Most were filled with hay, but one in the corner looked different, slightly smaller, with a curved lid that didn't quite match the others. "That one," Clara breathed. "I remember because the lid was special. Mama had found it somewhere and thought it was pretty." Jonas was already moving, bringing the lantern closer. The box was just above head height. He reached up, feeling along the edges, until his fingers found a catch. The lid swung down on hidden hinges, revealing a space behind the hay. Clara pressed close, holding the lantern higher as Jonas reached inside. His fingers brushed something wrapped in cloth. Carefully, he drew out a package about the size of a bread loaf, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with faded ribbon. They knelt together on the horse blanket as Clara untied the ribbon with trembling fingers. The oilcloth fell away to reveal a battered tin box, its surface dulled with age but still solid. Clara took a deep breath and lifted the lid. Inside, yellowed papers lay carefully folded. Clara lifted the top one with reverent hands, unfolding it in the lamplight. Her eyes filled with tears as she read the flowing script at the top. "It's Mama's deed," she whispered. "Look, Elizabeth Marie Conroy, heir to the Conroy homestead claim, consisting of 160 acres. And there's the territorial seal, just like you said we'd need." Jonas leaned closer, examining the document. The seal was intact, the signatures clear and official. This was exactly what they needed. Proof that the meadow had been Clara's mother's land, protected under the original Homestead Act. "This changes everything," he said quietly. "With this, we can stop the railroad from taking the meadow. But we'll need to get it to the land office before the council vote." Clara looked up sharply. "The vote's in 4 days. The land office is 20 miles away in Helena." Jonas nodded. "We'll need to leave at first light tomorrow. Can you be ready?" Clara's face showed a mix of hope and worry. "Myra usually sleeps late after her ladies' meetings. If I get my morning chores done extra early?" She trailed off, thinking, "Yes, I can be ready at dawn." "Good girl." Jonas helped her wrap the deed carefully back in its oilcloth. "But we can't risk taking it back to the house tonight. Best hide it somewhere safe until morning." They looked around the loft until Clara pointed to one of the support beams. "There, that beam has a hollow spot. Papa used to hide Christmas presents there sometimes." Jonas examined the beam and found the hidden cavity. The wrapped deed fit perfectly inside, invisible unless you knew where to look. As he slid the wooden cover back in place, they heard the distant sound of wheels on the road. "Someone's coming," Clara whispered, though it was too early to be Myra. They quickly straightened the hay and tools they'd moved, erasing signs of their search. Jonas helped Clara down the ladder, then checked that Dan was still hidden in the shadows. "I'll come for you at first light," he said softly. "Wait by the creek crossing where the wild roses grow. We can be in Helena by noon if we ride steady." Clara nodded, clutching the lantern. In its light, Jonas could see something new in her face, a spark of hope that hadn't been there before. It reminded him of spring flowers pushing through snow, determined to reach the sun. "Thank you, Mr. Clay," she whispered, "for believing me about the meadow, for helping." "Your mama's land deserves protecting," he answered simply. "Now go on. Don't want you caught out here." He watched until she reached the house safely, her lantern light merging with the warm glow from the kitchen windows. The evening wind carried the scent of wild roses from the creek, mixing with the sweet hay smell of the barn. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight hope had taken root. Jonas mounted Dan and turned toward home, moving quietly through the gathering dusk. Behind him, the barn stood solid and secret, guarding its precious document until morning. In just a few hours, they would begin their journey to Helena, a journey that might save Clara's mother's meadow and give the girl a chance to stand up for her inheritance. The evening stars were just beginning to appear as Jonas rode home, each one a bright point of promise in the darkening sky. Sometimes, he reflected, the greatest treasures were hidden in plain sight, just waiting for someone to care enough to look for them. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten when Jonas led his mule Dan through the pre-dawn stillness. A thin layer of frost crunched beneath their feet as they made their way to the creek crossing. The wild roses were barely visible in the gray light, their thorny branches outlined against the pale sky. Clara was already waiting, wrapped in her heaviest shawl against the morning chill. She had managed to change into her riding skirt, the one she rarely got to wear, and carried a small bundle of provisions. Her cheeks were pink from the cold and maybe something more, excitement perhaps, or nervousness about what lay ahead. "Morning," Jonas said softly, leading forward a gentle bay mare he'd borrowed from his neighbor. "This here's Penny. She's steady as they come." Clara approached the horse carefully, letting Penny sniff her hand before patting the mare's neck. "She's beautiful," she whispered, clearly trying to hide her apprehension. Jonas noticed her tension and kept his voice calm. "When's the last time you rode proper like?" "Not since Mama passed," Clara admitted. "Myra said it wasn't suitable." Jonas's jaw tightened briefly, but he kept his tone light. "Well, Penny here will take good care of you. Let's get you mounted up before the light gives us away." He helped Clara settle into the saddle, adjusting the stirrups to fit her. She gripped the pommel tightly, but her back was straight with determination. Jonas retrieved the deed from its hiding place in the barn beam, wrapping it carefully in his oilcloth before securing it in his saddlebag. They set out just as the sun crested the eastern mountains, painting the frost-covered grass in shades of gold. Jonas led them away from the main road, taking lesser-used trails that would keep them hidden from curious eyes. Clara rode carefully, concentrating on keeping her balance as Penny plodded along. "Loosen your grip a bit," Jonas suggested after a while. "Let your hips move with her stride. That's it. You're doing fine." Clara gradually relaxed as the morning wore on, gaining confidence with each mile. They stopped briefly at a sheltered hollow to rest the horses and share some of the biscuits and jerky Clara had packed. The spring sun had warmed the air and Clara shed her shawl, looking more comfortable in the saddle when they resumed their journey. "Mama used to tell me stories about riding across the prairie when she was young," Clara said as they picked their way through a stand of aspens. "She said there was nothing like the feeling of moving with a horse, like you were flying but still connected to the earth." Jonas nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. "Your mama sounds like she was quite a woman." "She was," Clara said softly. "She taught me about all the wild things, which plants could heal, which berries were safe to eat. She said knowledge of the land was worth more than gold." She paused, adjusting her seat as Penny stepped over a fallen log. The meadow was her favorite place. She said it was where heaven touched earth in springtime. They reached the creek at midday, the water running clear and cold with mountain snowmelt. Jonas helped Clara dismount, steadying her as her legs wobbled from the unaccustomed exercise. They led the horses to drink while sharing the last of their provisions in the dappled shade of cottonwood trees. "How much further?" Clara asked, massaging her sore muscles. "About 4 more hours at this pace," and Jonas replied, checking the position of the sun. "We'll make it before the land office closes." He studied her face. "How are you holding up?" Clara straightened her spine. "I'm fine, just not used to so much riding." Jonas nodded approvingly. "You're doing well. Penny's taken a shine to you." The mare had indeed stayed close to Clara, occasionally nudging her shoulder for attention. Clara smiled, stroking Penny's velvet nose. "I forgot how nice it is being around horses like this. They don't judge you for how you look." Jonas busied himself adjusting Dan's saddle straps, giving her a moment to compose herself. When they mounted up again, Clara seemed steadier, more confident in her seat. The afternoon sun was casting long shadows when they finally rode into the county seat. The town was larger than Pine Ridge, with actual brick buildings lining the main street and a proper courthouse dome rising above the rooflines. Clara's eyes were wide as she took in the sights: the millinery shop with its fancy window displays, the photographer's studio, the three-story hotel with its wrought iron balconies. The land office occupied the ground floor of a solid stone building near the courthouse. Jonas helped Clara dismount and tied their horses at the hitching rail. A brass bell tinkled as they entered the cool, document-scented interior. Mr. Running Bear sat at a large desk near the window, his silver hair neatly braided, his black suit impeccable despite the day's heat. He looked up as they entered, his dark eyes sharp and assessing beneath heavy brows. "May I help you?" His voice was deep and formal, with just a trace of accent. Jonas removed his hat. "Mr. Running Bear, I'm Jonas Clay. This here's Miss Clara Whitaker. We've come about filing a petition regarding the Conroy homestead claim." The clerk's expression shifted slightly at the mention of the name. "Conroy? Elizabeth Conroy's daughter?" Clara stepped forward, nervous but determined. "Yes, sir. She was my mother." Running Bear's face softened. "I remember your mother well, Miss Whitaker. She always treated this office, and me, with great respect. Unlike some." He gestured to the chairs before his desk. "Please sit. Tell me what brings you here." Over the next hour, they explained about the railroad's plans and the upcoming council vote. Running Bear listened intently, occasionally making notes in his precise handwriting. When Jonas produced the deed from his saddlebag, the clerk examined it carefully, holding it up to the late afternoon light. "The seal is genuine," he confirmed, "and the survey marks match our records." He looked at Clara. "Your mother was very particular about having everything properly documented. She understood the importance of paper proof in a world where memories can be convenient." Clara nodded, blinking back tears. "Can you help us, Mr. Running Bear? Can we stop them from taking the meadow?" The elderly clerk straightened in his chair. "With this deed and my testimony about its provenance, yes. The original homestead claim specifically protects that parcel from forced sale or seizure." He pulled out an official form. "I will file the petition immediately and place the deed in the office safe until the council meeting." Jonas watched as Running Bear carefully recorded the details, his penmanship as elegant as calligraphy. The clerk's movements were deliberate, almost ceremonial, as if he were performing a sacred duty rather than mere bureaucratic tasks. "There," Running Bear said finally, sanding the ink dry. "The petition is filed. I will send notice to the council members tonight." He opened the large safe behind his desk and placed the deed inside with reverent care. "It will be secure here until the meeting." "Thank you, sir," Clara said softly. "Mama would be grateful for your help." Running Bear's eyes crinkled at the corners. "Your mother understood something many forget. That land is not just property to be bought and sold. It holds memories, stories, life itself. The meadow you wish to protect, it is sacred in its own way, yes?" Clara nodded, unable to speak. "Then we will do our best to honor that." He rose, signaling the end of their meeting. "The council meets in 3 days. I suggest you find lodging and rest. The widow Patterson runs a respectable boarding house 2 streets over. Tell her I sent you." Outside, the sun was setting behind the courthouse dome, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Jonas collected their horses while Clara stood on the boardwalk, still processing everything that had happened. "I've never stayed at a boarding house before," she admitted as they walked their horses down the quiet street. "Widow Patterson's is a good place," Jonas assured her. "Clean, quiet, serves a proper breakfast." The boarding house proved to be a well-kept 2-story home with lace curtains and a neat flower garden. The widow herself answered their knock, a plump, cheerful woman who clucked sympathetically when she saw how saddle-sore Clara was. "Land sakes, child, you look done in. Come along. I've got a nice room at the back with a view of the garden. And you, Mr. Clay, can have the room just off the kitchen." She bustled them inside, calling for hot water and clean towels. Later that evening, Clara sat in the parlor, watching the last light fade from the sky through the lace-curtained windows. The deed was safe. They had an ally in Mr. Running Bear, and for the first time in years she was sleeping somewhere other than the ranch. It felt like a dream. "Penny did well today," Jonas said quietly from his seat by the fire. "And so did you." Clara smiled, touching her sore muscles. "I reckon I'll be feeling it tomorrow." Worth it, though? She thought about the deed in the safe, about Mr. Running Bear's understanding, about her mother's meadow waiting to be saved. "Yes," she said firmly. "Every step." The parlor clock chimed 9, its gentle tone so different from the harsh clang of the ranch bell. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, Clara was content to sit in the quiet room, watching the fire cast dancing shadows on the wall and feeling, for the first time in years, that she was exactly where she needed to be. The morning sun painted the eastern sky in delicate shades of pink and gold as Jonas and Clara set out from the boarding house. Widow Patterson had insisted on sending them off with fresh biscuits wrapped in a clean cloth, tucked safely in Jonas's saddlebag alongside their other provisions. Clara sat straighter in her saddle today, more confident after yesterday's long ride. The horses' hooves kicked up small clouds of dust as they made their way along the quiet road leading back to Pine Ridge. The air was crisp with early spring, carrying the promise of warming days ahead. "Might be worth stopping at the meadow on our way back," Jonas suggested, after they'd been riding for several hours. "Check how the spring thaw is coming along." Clara's heart quickened at the suggestion. "Do you think we have time?" "Reckon so. We're making good progress." Jonas adjusted his hat against the climbing sun. "Besides, seems fitting to pay a visit, considering what we're fighting for." They turned off the main road when they reached Sawyer's Creek, following a narrow trail that wound through stands of young aspens. The trees' pale bark glowed in the midday light, their branches starting to show the first hints of budding leaves. As they crested a small rise, the meadow suddenly spread out before them, a natural bowl cradled by gentle slopes. Clara drew in a sharp breath. The winter snow had mostly melted, feeding countless tiny rivulets that traced silver paths through the awakening grass. Early spring greenery was already pushing through the thawing earth, creating a patchwork of emerald and gold. Jonas helped Clara dismount, then led both horses to a shady spot where they could graze. Clara stood at the meadow's edge, drinking in the sight. The last time she'd been here with her mother, they'd gathered armfuls of blue lupines and golden prairie stars. Now the first tender shoots were just beginning to emerge. "Go on," Jonas said softly. "The ground's firm enough." Clara stepped carefully into the grass, her boots leaving gentle impressions. The earth felt alive beneath her feet, soft but supporting, nothing like the treacherous marsh that had nearly claimed her life. She made her way to the center of the meadow, where a large flat rock served as a natural resting place. Memories washed over her, sitting on this very rock while her mother explained which plants could heal and which could harm, watching butterflies dance among the flowers, falling asleep in the warm sun while her mother sketched in her notebook. Tears spilled down Clara's cheeks, but she didn't try to hide them. "They'll bloom here again, Mama," she whispered, touching the cool surface of the rock. "I promise. Your flowers will keep growing here, just like they always have." Jonas maintained a respectful distance, checking the horses and scanning the horizon. He understood that some moments needed space and silence to unfold properly. After a while, Clara walked back to where he waited. Her eyes were red, but there was a new steadiness in her bearing. "Thank you for bringing me here." Jonas nodded. Sometimes a body needs to remember what they're fighting for. They mounted up and continued toward Pine Ridge, the sun now well past its zenith. Clara found herself memorizing every detail of the landscape, the way the light caught the remnants of snow in the shadowed draws, the sound of water running beneath melting ice, the first meadowlarks calling from fence posts along the way. It was late afternoon when they finally approached the Whitaker Ranch. The familiar weathered buildings looked somehow different to Clara now, as if her brief time away had changed how she saw her home. Smoke rose from the kitchen chimney, and she could see Myra's shadow moving behind the curtains. The door opened before they reached the house. Myra stood on the porch, her arms crossed tight against her chest, lips pressed into a thin line. The warmth of the meadow seemed to evaporate in the chill of her stepmother's gaze. "So you finally decided to return," Myra said, her voice carrying across the yard, "after gallivanting about the territory, stirring up trouble." Clara dismounted, struggling to maintain her composure. "We weren't stirring trouble, Myra. We were taking care of important business." "Important business?" Myra's laugh held no humor. "Is that what you call sneaking around behind my back? Consorting with this mountain man?" She gestured dismissively at Jonas, who had remained mounted on his horse. "Mr. Clay has been nothing but helpful and respectful," Clara said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "Which is more than I can say for some." Myra's eyes narrowed. "Get inside and wash up. You've caused enough scandal for one day." She turned on her heel and disappeared into the house, leaving the door open like a command. Jonas cleared his throat. "I'll see to the horses before I go, Miss Clara." Clara nodded gratefully, knowing he was giving her time to collect herself. She carried her small traveling bag inside, trying to ignore the weight of Myra's disapproval that seemed to fill the house like smoke. The rest of the evening passed in tense silence. Clara helped prepare supper, ate quickly, and retreated to her room as soon as she could. She was about to change for bed when voices from the parlor caught her attention. Carefully, she crept to the top of the stairs. "This complicates everything," a man's voice said. "The railroad agent, Thomas Keene. If they've found documentation, then we'll find a way around it," Myra snapped. "I won't let that girl and her primitive friend ruin everything we've worked for." "The land office takes these claims seriously, Mrs. Whitaker. If they've filed a petition, then find a way to stop them." Myra's voice rose sharply before dropping to a harsh whisper. "You promised me this would be simple, clean, just another land purchase for the railroad's expansion." "And it will be." Keene's tone turned soothing. "We just need to adjust our strategy, find a way to neutralize Jonas Clay's influence. The girl will be easier to handle once he's out of the picture." Clara's stomach clenched as she listened. The floorboard beneath her foot creaked slightly, and she froze. After a moment, the conversation in the parlor continued, but she'd heard enough. She crept back to her room, heart pounding. Lying in bed that night, Clara couldn't shake the memory of Keene's words about neutralizing Jonas's influence. She knew her stepmother was capable of cruel manipulation. She'd experienced it firsthand over the years, but this felt different, more dangerous. Through her window, she could see the moon rising over the distant hills, casting silver light across the sleeping land. Somewhere out there, past the ranch's boundaries, lay her mother's meadow, its soil growing richer with each spring melt, waiting for the flowers to return. Clara touched the window pane, cool glass beneath her fingers. "We won't let them win, Mama," she whispered. "Whatever they're planning, we'll find a way to stop them. I promise." Clara jolted awake, her heart racing before her mind could catch up to what had roused her. The air felt wrong, thick and acrid. She sat up in bed, moonlight filtering through her thin curtains, and that's when she smelled it. Smoke. Throwing off her quilt, she rushed to the window. The sight made her blood run cold. The barn was wreathed in flames, orange tongues licking up the weathered boards and reaching toward the night sky. Black smoke billowed upward, lit from beneath by the inferno. "No, no, no," she whispered, then shouted, "Fire! The barn's on fire!" She grabbed her shawl and ran down the stairs, not bothering with shoes. The floorboards creaked under her feet as she thundered through the silent house. Behind her, she heard Myra's door open, followed by confused exclamations. Clara burst out onto the porch. The heat hit her like a wall, even from 50 yards away. The horses were screaming inside the barn, their terrified whinnies cutting through the roar of the flames. Without thinking, she ran toward the burning structure. "Clara May!" Myra's voice cracked across the yard. "Don't you dare!" But Clara was already moving. The gravel bit into her bare feet as she sprinted to the smaller side door. Smoke poured out when she yanked it open, making her eyes water and her lungs burn. She could hear the horses thrashing in their stalls, wild with fear. "Easy, easy there," she called, trying to keep her voice steady as she felt her way along the wall. The heat was incredible, making her skin feel tight and dry. Through the thickening smoke, she could see the flames spreading across the roof beams. A figure appeared beside her. Jonas Clay, his bandana pulled up over his nose and mouth. She hadn't even heard him arrive. "Get the doors," he shouted, already moving toward the nearest stall. "All of them. We need clear paths." Clara nodded, stumbling to the row of stall doors. Her fingers fumbled with the latches as Jonas worked his way down the opposite side. The horses kicked and reared, but his calm voice seemed to cut through their panic. "That's it, easy now. Come on, girl, this way." One by one, they managed to lead or chase the horses out into the night. The last one, Old Thunder, refused to move until Jonas grabbed his halter and practically dragged him toward the exit. They emerged into the cool air just as a terrible groaning sound filled the barn. "Back!" Jonas yanked Clara away from the building. "Everyone back!" They retreated to a safe distance, watching as the roof began to cave in. The flames had spread to every corner now, turning the beloved old barn into a massive torch against the star-filled sky. The heat was so intense that Clara could feel it burning her face even from 30 yards away. People from nearby farms had begun to arrive, drawn by the glow on the horizon. A bucket line formed from the well to the barn, but Clara knew it was already too late. The water sizzled uselessly against the inferno, turning to steam before it could do any good. Myra stood on the edge of the crowd, her face lit orange by the flames. "The tools," she cried. "All our tools, the tack, the feed." Her hands were pressed against her cheeks as she watched their livelihood burn. Clara barely heard her. All she could think about was the hollow beam where they'd hidden the deed 2 nights ago, the tin box that held their only hope of saving her mother's meadow. She took an involuntary step toward the barn, but Jonas's hand closed around her arm. "Don't," he said quietly. "Nothing in there is worth your life." A sob escaped her throat. "But the deed. I know." His voice was rough with emotion. "I know, Clara." They stood together as the barn collapsed in on itself, sending a shower of sparks spiraling up into the dark sky. The horses huddled in the far pasture, their eyes reflecting the flames. The bucket line eventually stopped, the volunteers accepting that there was nothing left to save. Clara sank to her knees in the damp grass, tears streaming down her smoke-stained face. All their careful plans, all their hopes of protecting the meadow, gone up in smoke. She felt Jonas's solid presence beside her, heard his breathing change as he drew in a sharp breath. "First light," he said, his voice so low only she could hear it. "I'll check the ruins at first light. Fire might not have reached everything." But they both knew it was a slim hope. The barn had burned so hot that even now, hours later, waves of heat still rolled off the smoldering ruins. The tin box, hidden in the beam, would have been at the heart of the inferno. Myra moved through the crowd, accepting condolences with a trembling voice. "Such a terrible accident," she kept saying. "It could have happened to anyone. Thank heavens no one was hurt." Clara looked up at Jonas and saw his jaw clench. There was a cold fury in his eyes that she'd never seen before. He didn't believe this was an accident any more than she did, but proving it was another matter entirely. The sky began to lighten in the east, turning the smoke a sickly gray. Most of the neighbors had gone home, leaving only the immediate family and Jonas to watch the ruins cool. Clara hadn't moved from her spot on the ground, her bare feet tucked under her skirts, her shawl pulled tight against the pre-dawn chill. "You should get some rest," Jonas said quietly, helping her to her feet. "I'll start looking as soon as it's safe to get closer." Clara nodded, too exhausted to argue. Her throat felt raw from the smoke, and her eyes burned. But as she turned toward the house, she caught sight of something that made her pause. Myra was standing near the gate, speaking in hushed tones with a man whose fine coat seemed out of place among the ash and soot. Thomas Keene, the railroad agent, had arrived sometime during the night, and now he stood with Myra, their heads close together, discussing something that clearly couldn't wait until a more appropriate hour. Jonas saw them too. His hand tightened on Clara's shoulder for just a moment before he guided her toward the house. "Get some sleep," he repeated. "I'll handle things out here." Clara wanted to protest, to insist on helping search the ruins, but exhaustion dragged at her limbs. She managed to climb the stairs to her room, where she sat heavily on her bed. Through her window, she could see the smoking remains of the barn, black against the lightening sky. She thought of all the memories that had burned away with the structure, helping her father mend tack on rainy days, learning to milk cows in the early morning light, the special hiding places she'd discovered in the loft. And now the deed, her last connection to her mother's meadow, was probably nothing but ashes. But as she finally lay down, still fully dressed, Clara remembered something her mother used to say. "Hope is like those spring flowers, dear heart. Sometimes it has to push through frozen ground to bloom again." She held on to that thought as she drifted into an uneasy sleep, while outside her window, Jonas Clay stood watching the ruins, waiting for them to cool enough to begin his search. The sun rose over the mountains, painting the smoke-filled sky in shades of pink and gold, but Jonas's expression remained as hard as granite as he considered what had been lost, and what might have been gained by those who had engineered this night's work. The horses stamped restlessly in the pasture, their coats still smelling of smoke. Birds began their morning songs in the distance, nature's rhythm continuing despite the destruction. And in the ruins of the barn, secrets lay buried beneath charred timber and ash, waiting to be uncovered in the light of day. The sun crept over the Bitterroot Mountains, painting the smoke-filled sky in watercolor shades of rose and gold. Jonas Clay stood at the edge of the barn ruins, waiting for the last wisps of steam to fade from the charred timbers. The night's fire had reduced the proud old structure to a blackened skeleton, still radiating waves of heat into the crisp morning air. Clara huddled nearby, her hands clenched tight in her shawl. She hadn't slept more than an hour, her face drawn with exhaustion and worry. The morning dew had soaked through her boots, but she hardly noticed. All her attention was fixed on Jonas as he tested the temperature of a beam with the back of his hand. "Careful," she whispered, though they were alone. Myra had finally gone inside to rest, and the ranch hands were occupied with securing temporary shelter for the rescued horses. Jonas nodded, moving with the deliberate care of a man who'd learned respect for fire's lingering dangers. He picked his way through the debris, testing each step before putting his full weight down. The ash swirled around his boots, carrying the sharp scent of burned hay and scorched metal. Clara wanted to help, but Jonas had insisted she stay back where the footing was sure. Instead, she kept watch, ready to warn him if anyone approached. Her heart pounded every time a timber shifted or settled beneath his feet. Jonas worked his way toward the center of the ruins where the loft beam had stood. Most of the upper structure had collapsed inward, creating a treacherous maze of splintered wood and twisted metal. But Jonas moved like a man following a map in his mind, zeroing in on the spot where they'd hidden the tin box. "The support post should have fallen this way," he muttered, more to himself than Clara. His hands were already black with soot as he carefully shifted smaller pieces of debris. Clara held her breath as he worked. The morning light grew stronger, throwing long shadows across the ruins. A meadowlark called from the fence post, its clear notes a stark contrast to the destruction before them. Suddenly, Jonas went still. Clara's heart skipped a beat as she watched him bend down, moving aside a chunk of charred wood. There, half buried in the ash, was a rectangular shape. "Jonas?" Her voice quavered with hope and fear. He didn't answer immediately, working carefully to extract the object from its bed of ash. When he straightened, he held a blackened lockbox in his hands. The metal was discolored and hot to the touch, but intact. Clara pressed her hands to her mouth, hardly daring to breathe as Jonas carried the box to a clear spot near the ruin's edge. He set it down gently and worked the latch, which gave way with a protesting creak. The lid opened to reveal the oilcloth bundle, smoky-smelling but whole. Clara's knees went weak with relief. Jonas quickly tucked the package beneath his coat, glancing toward the house. "Not a word," he said softly. "Not until tomorrow's council meeting. Your stepmother can't know it survived." Clara nodded, wiping tears from her smoke-stained cheeks. "I thought for sure it was lost." "That oilcloth was a blessing," Jonas said. "And that old box was made to last." He brushed ash from his hands and straightened. "Now we've got work to do before tomorrow." They moved away from the ruins, walking slowly toward the corral as if discussing the horses. Jonas kept his voice low. The council meets at 10 o'clock. You'll need to speak to them, Clara. Tell them about your mother's connection to the land. Clara's stomach clenched. Me? But I can't. You can, Jonas said firmly. Your voice carries more weight than you think. These are your mother's flowers we're protecting, your family's legacy. They spent the next hour by the corral under the pretense of checking the horses while Jonas helped Clara organize her thoughts. The morning sun grew warmer as they worked out what she would say, how she would present the deed, how she would explain its importance. Remember, Jonas advised, speak from your heart about what the meadow means. Let them see it through your eyes. Clara practiced in whispers, gaining confidence with each attempt. Jonas listened patiently, offering suggestions to make her words stronger, helping her find the courage in her own voice. When Myra appeared on the porch around mid-morning, they separated naturally, as if they'd merely been discussing the horse's care. Jonas tipped his hat and headed home, the precious deed still hidden beneath his coat. Clara returned to her chores, her heart lighter despite her nervousness about tomorrow. Throughout the day, she found moments to practice her speech while churning butter or feeding chickens. She thought about her mother's stories of the meadow, how the wildflowers had drawn her there year after year. She remembered the way her mother's eyes would light up at the first spring blooms, how she'd taught Clara the names of each flower, the way they'd spread quilts among the grass and share simple picnics. By late afternoon, Clara had worked out most of what she wanted to say. She went about her tasks with quiet determination, knowing that tomorrow would test her courage in ways she'd never imagined. Every time doubt crept in, she thought of Jonas's steady confidence in her, his belief that her voice mattered. The sun was setting when Jonas returned, carrying a basket of eggs as an excuse for his visit. He found Clara in the kitchen garden, pulling early spring weeds. "You ready?" he asked quietly, setting the basket beside her. Clara brushed dirt from her hands and stood. "I think so. I've been practicing all day. Let's hear it one more time." They moved to the far corner of the garden where they wouldn't be overheard. Clara took a deep breath and began speaking softly, telling the story of her mother's meadow, explaining why it deserved protection. Her voice grew stronger as she continued, painting a picture of the land's beauty and significance. Jonas listened intently, nodding at the right moments. When she finished, he smiled. "That's it, Clara. That's exactly what they need to hear." "Do you really think they'll listen?" she asked, uncertainty creeping back into her voice. "They'll listen," Jonas assured her. "You speak truth, and truth has its own power. Besides," he added with a gentle smile, "you've got more strength in you than this whole town realizes. Tomorrow's your chance to show them." Clara squared her shoulders, drawing herself up to her full height. She might not be what the town considered beautiful, might not fit their ideas of grace, but she had something more important. A purpose, a truth to defend, a legacy to protect. "Thank you, Jonas," she said softly, "for believing in me when nobody else did." He ducked his head, uncomfortable with the gratitude. "Get some rest tonight. Tomorrow's an important day." As Jonas walked away, Clara stood in the garden watching the sunset paint the mountains gold. Tomorrow would change everything, one way or another. But for the first time in years, she felt ready to stand up and be heard. The deed was safe, her words were prepared, and she had an ally she could trust. She thought about her mother's meadow, imagining the wildflowers that would soon begin pushing through the soil. Like those determined blooms, she too would find the strength to rise, to reach for the light, to claim her place in the world. Inside the house, she heard Myra moving about, preparing supper. Clara took one last deep breath of the evening air, drawing courage from the land itself, from the memory of her mother, from Jonas's quiet faith in her. Tomorrow she would give voice to all she held dear. Tomorrow she would speak her truth before the council. Tomorrow she would fight for her mother's meadow with everything she had. Market day dawned bright and clear, with spring sunshine warming the wooden sidewalks of Pine Ridge's town square. Wagons and riders had been arriving since sunrise, filling the dusty streets with the sounds of commerce and conversation. The council members gathered on the courthouse steps, their formal coats marking them as men of importance. Clara stood at the edge of the crowd, her freshly pressed calico dress rustling in the morning breeze. Jonas caught her eye from across the square and gave a slight nod. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward into the center of the gathering. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice wavering at first. "I need to speak about the Whitaker Meadow." A few snickers rippled through the crowd. Someone coughed mockingly. Clara's cheeks flushed, but she lifted her chin and continued. "That meadow was my mother's pride," she said, her voice growing stronger. "She planted the first wildflowers there 20 years ago, when she and my father homesteaded this land. Every spring she'd take me there to learn the names of each bloom." The murmurs quieted as she spoke of her family's history, of her mother's dream to create beauty in the harsh territory. Even those who had laughed began to listen as Clara described how the railroad's plans would destroy not just flowers, but a piece of Pine Ridge's heritage. When she finished, Jonas stepped forward, the rescued deed in his weathered hands. Mr. Running Bear met him at the courthouse steps, carefully examining the document. The Cherokee clerk's eyes crinkled with recognition as he held the paper up. "This deed is authentic," he announced clearly. "The seal and signature are genuine territorial markings." A buzz of conversation swept through the crowd. Several ranchers who had known Clara's mother moved closer, nodding in approval. Others joined them, speaking up about their own concerns over the railroad's aggressive expansion. Clara stood straighter, feeling the tide of opinion shift as more neighbors stepped forward to support her cause. The council members huddled together on the courthouse steps, their voices low as they discussed the evidence. Mayor Thompson finally stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Given the legal proof before us and the clear wishes of our community, the council votes unanimously to uphold the original homestead protection of the Whitaker Meadow," he announced firmly. Railroad Agent Keene's face darkened. He snatched his hat from his head and stormed toward his waiting horse, his fine coat flapping in the spring wind. The sound of his mount's hooves faded quickly down the dusty street. Townspeople who had never given Clara a second glance now pressed forward to shake her hand. Mrs. Peterson, who once whispered cruel words behind her back, touched her arm gently. "Your mama would be proud, dear," she said, eyes warm with newfound respect. Even Tom Fletcher and his ranch hands, who had laughed at her misfortune in the marsh, nodded as they passed. Their faces showed a new recognition of the quiet strength they had overlooked. Jonas hung back by the hitching post, his weathered face creased in a rare smile as he watched Clara receive the town's changed regard. Pride shone in his eyes, but he made no move to join the crowd. This was her moment. Myra stood apart from it all, her lips pressed into a thin line. Without a word, she climbed into her wagon and snapped the reins, leaving Clara behind in the square. As the crowd began to thin, Jonas approached Clara. They walked together along the familiar road toward home, their boots raising small puffs of dust. "That meadow's yours now, proper and legal," Jonas said quietly. "Those flowers will bloom bright under your care, just like your mama intended." Clara smiled, touching the deed in her pocket. For the first time in years, she felt truly at home in Pine Ridge. The meadow transformed with each passing day. Clara and Jonas worked side by side, their hands deep in the rich spring soil as they planted precious seeds of blue columbine that Clara had gathered seasons ago. The morning dew sparkled on new sprouts and meadowlarks called from fence posts as they worked. "Your mother knew just where these flowers would take best," Jonas said, showing Clara how to space the delicate seedlings. "See how the land dips here? Makes a natural catch basin for rain." Clara nodded, her movements sure and steady now. Gone was the hesitation that once marked her steps. She worked with purpose, marking rows with twine and checking the soil with knowing fingers. Several times a week, folks from town would appear at the meadow's edge, carrying cloth-wrapped bundles of plant starts and seeds. Mrs. Peterson brought wild lupine from her garden, while Tom Fletcher and his hands helped set cedar posts for the new fence line. "Reckon we owe you this much," Tom said gruffly, tamping down the earth around a post. "Way we treated you before, well, it weren't right." Jonas showed Clara the proper way to string wire, keeping it taut enough to turn cattle but not so tight it would snap in winter's cold. She learned quickly, her natural intelligence shining through as she mastered each new skill. Myra kept to the main house these days, watching from behind lace curtains. She no longer interfered, perhaps finally understanding that some things were worth more than money. The spring air filled with birdsong and the gentle clinking of tools. Clara's laughter, once so rare, now rang out freely across the meadow. Her face glowed with quiet joy as she worked the land that had meant so much to her mother, making it bloom anew. The evening painted the Bitterroot Mountains in deepening shades of purple and gold. Clara stood quietly among the tender green shoots rising from the dark soil, her calico skirts rustling against the new grass. The sweet scent of wild roses drifted on the cooling air, as shadows lengthened across the meadow she had fought so hard to protect. The sound of boots on packed earth made her turn. Jonas approached with his familiar steady gait, carrying a worn burlap sack in his weathered hands. The setting sun caught in his graying beard as he drew near. "Found these up in the high country," he said, holding out the sack. "Mountain columbine seeds, tough as they come." His eyes crinkled at the corners as he added, "These'll bloom long after both of us are gone." Clara took the sack, feeling the weight of future flowers in her hands. Her throat tightened with emotion as she looked up at the man who had changed her life with one act of kindness by a quicksand pool. "Thank you, Jonas," she said softly, "not just for these seeds, for believing in me when nobody else would." Her voice carried all the gratitude her heart held for the months of quiet support, steady friendship, and unwavering faith in her strength. Jonas touched the brim of his hat, a gesture both gentle and familiar. Without another word, he turned and started back toward the foothills, his figure growing smaller against the darkening sky. Clara remained in the meadow's golden light, holding the precious seeds close. Behind her, lamplight began to glow in the windows of the Whitaker house, but she kept her gaze forward, toward the promise of flowers yet to bloom and the open land that was finally, truly her own. A smile of deep contentment graced her face as she stood rooted in her rightful place, surrounded by the legacy she would nurture for years to come. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.